Okay, so let's see. Good. How we approach. Okay. So, cephalopods, there's, probably two of them, squid and octopus. And then there's also, what are they called? Something, cuttlefish. We don't have them in these waters, but if you go into kind of tropical waters in the Indian Ocean and off of Africa and stuff like that, there's these cuttlefish, and they're also like that. All of these species have these kinds of, well, they're very small, but they can change color, they can change shape, all sorts of different things. So they can all either blend in, either for hunting or not. There's also one cuttlefish that actually, I'll show it to you later when we're looking at predation and stuff, but when it's hunting, it kind of cycles, it's kind of like a strobe light, and it mesmerizes the prey. It's really totally bizarre. It's like right out of H.G. Wells, or some, I forget which one. Yeah, the War of the Worlds or something like that. But it's really amazing. Anyway, and they have huge visual cortexes, as you well imagine. But this is how they kind of navigate, and they also use it, of course, for courtship and reproduction as well. So, oh, come on. Okay, so remember Tinbergen. He's one of the ethologists. He won a Nobel Prize for physiology and medicine. And he kind of broke things down into proximate mechanisms. Who remembers what a proximate mechanism is? I know I talked about it. What do you think? Remember what a proximate mechanism is? Versus an ultimate mechanism.
Proximate was more about trying to describe the behavior or why they do something, not the reason for it.
So it's a how.
Yeah.
Okay. How, in this case, it can be, forget about behavior, morphology, physiology, whatever. It's a how sort of thing. So there are usually, in terms of proximate, there are mechanisms that cause behavior and all sorts of different levels. So right now you're looking at me, or maybe you're not looking at me, I don't care. But at the same time that you're looking at me, your visual cortex is doing all sorts of stuff to make sense of perhaps what I'm saying, even if I'm not making much sense at all, right? So you're shaking your head. But so one level, of course, is the first visual image that you get of me, and then that's one proximate mechanism, that's one how. That kind of cascades into this whole visual cortex in terms of what's actually going on, and then there's also my voice going on as well. And so each of those different things are proximate mechanisms. It's not just like necessarily the thing that triggers it, then there's hormonal responses, all sorts of different things. Okay, now, as I mentioned also in terms of developing, how does behavior develop, the same sort of thing happens. These are proximate mechanisms. If behavior doesn't develop, or the animal doesn't get the proper cues initially, they don't develop it properly. Now, ultimate mechanisms are basically, there's two kinds of things. One is, of course, is the behavior actually adaptive? Does it increase an animal's fitness? Is there variation in that? So natural selection can actually work. And then, of course, there's also phylogeny. So there's, what we might call phylogenetic constraint. You might have, let's say, a lineage of, we'll talk about cephalopods, octopus, and cuttlefish, and all that. They all have these things in their skin that they can have great control over in terms of visual. So they can either, become kind of mimic the background, either to hunt or to keep away from predators. So if you look at that, that's a phylogenetic thing that the whole lineage is actually inherited. So when you're doing, like, let's say, the comparative method, you want to know, well, let's say with the cuttlefish, there might be some other behavior that they do that only that lineage does compared to the other two. So we want to know kind of first, what was the ancestral environment like? And that's looking at basically phylogeny, right? So the ancestral environment obviously had a lot to do with adaptation, and a lot of that was then kind of constrained into that whole lineage in terms of how it's adapted to its environment. Of course, there's genes involved. A lot of those, if it's phylogenetic, they're not changing very much. If it's actually adaptive, there's some new environment that favors certain genes versus others. And then at the individual level, so there's a development. So now we're back into proximate mechanisms, right? Hormones and all that, behavior again, and then back to evolution. And so you can have both. In terms of evolution, you can have stuff that's actually constrained because of evolutionary heritage, right? And then you can have stuff that's actually under adaptive control because of new environments. Both of those things are happening. And you can ask questions, well, how did the behavior influence fitness? How did the behavior evolve in the first place? What were the ancestors like where it first evolved? Okay. So basically, proximate questions are actually how questions. And in this class, we're going to be dealing a lot just with proximate mechanisms. How those mechanisms happen, what are the different mechanisms behind them. We'll look at everything from nervous systems and hormones, as well as different types of behavior under different conditions. So let's say we'll look at predation at a certain point, and in terms of both the predator and the prey. Obviously, the ultimate mechanism there is the ultimate importance is, well, certain prey already maybe have, like these, let's say, insects that feed on certain plants. They've already inherited this ability to detoxify certain plants, right? So they're able to feed on it. In other cases, and then there's also an ongoing evolutionary arms race with the insect and the plant, as just like a cheetah and an antelope, right? Each one is the faster the cheetah, it gets the slower antelope, and only the antelope that are the fastest are the ones that actually survive. And if they're so fast that the cheetah can't catch them, then there's more pressure on cheetahs to get faster and faster and faster.
So co-evolving.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So you guys know what food caching is?
No.
Anybody? Okay. Yeah.
Isn't it when the bird hides the nuts or seeds for
Mm-hmm.
goes back to it later?
Do humans do caching?
Yeah.
Where? Give me an example. Huh?
In our house.
Yeah. What are they caching?
I don't know, like cookies or something. Like in our family likes and we want them, so we just hide them.
Mm-hmm. Or it could be, back in the day when there weren't banks, you were cashing money all over the place, right? You knew where it was, but you didn't want anybody else to know. One of the things I did was I would cache wood. I love wood. No, I do. I just absolutely. I look at a tree, and I think, how many cords of wood are in that tree?
Are you barbecuing?
No. I had a wood stove for heat, and I used to live in Topanga, and then I did the same thing in Nevada. I should have been born, back in the day, in the 1800s when wood stoves were big. I just love them. They're just totally cool. So I cast. Now I hoard wood. We'll say that. I don't make small caches of wood all over the place. I usually make, a big pile of wood, stack it nice and all that. And I don't even feel good unless I've got, like 3 cords. In Nevada, I needed at least 3 cords of wood a winter. So if I wasn't getting it, I was feeling really nervous. Pretty much like birds are when they're caching. They're doing the same sort of thing. They're caching food. Now, this is a Clark's Nutcracker, one of the all-time great cachers. Corvids are jays and nutcrackers, ravens, crows, rooks, all sorts of different, those are all of the same family. They're notoriously intelligent, and they're also, a lot of them have incredibly good spatial memory. Now, the ones that cache much more than others, so let's say around here we have a species called a scrub jay, and they cache, but they don't cache to the extent that, let's say, Clark's Nutcrackers, because it turns out they're one of the few animals where their chicks actually are fed nuts instead of pine nuts in this case, instead of actually insects. Insects have much more protein, so it takes them longer to develop. So these animals can make up to like 30,000 different caches during the season. Their spatial memories are much, much better than ours, right? Just incredible feats. And so this is actually a kind of a setup where birds are allowed to cache, and then you take them out and you put them back, let's say, a few days later, and can they recover all their caches? That's the question, and usually, obviously, they can. And then you can do a whole bunch of different experiments, but if you do a bunch of different birds, let's say in this case you've got food-storing birds, let's say corvids, nutcrackers, and then you have other birds that don't store food, like robins. Robins don't store food. Robins are thrushes. They eat a lot of fruit. There's a lot of different thrushes that do that. They're really not very smart birds in terms of spatial memory, but in general, too. They're just not sharp. But they have a very nice song compared to, corvids, so they kind of make up for it. But if you were to actually look at food-storing birds, let me see here. Oh, I don't want that. Let's see. There we go. So, so the hippocampus, it turns out, is the area in the brain where we lay down memories as well as birds. And then after they're laid down, there's a process of actually they become stored. And in terms of hippocampal volume, you would expect actually that birds that can remember stuff better than others, the hippocampus would be bigger, and it is. And so if we actually look at food storing and non-food storing birds, we see that food storing birds have bigger hippocampus. Now, it's not exactly, a one-to-one, There are some animals that, even though they might have slightly smaller brains, like the whole primate lineage is fairly good at remembering things and remembering specific things. And other animals are also good at that. Let's say these birds, in terms of, and hippocampal volume is actually considering body weight. So it's not just total, but body weight adjusted. And some animals might actually have a bigger hippocampus, but they don't remember as well. So corvids in particular, the whole group is actually pretty good at remembering where they put things. Now, obviously it's important. This is really important because if they don't remember where things are, they're going to starve. A lot of these birds also, well, do you think it'd be better to put everything in one place or in a bunch of different places? And in environment, which environment would favor what? Anybody?
Well, if you put everything in one place, if someone happened to come upon it, they'd steal everything. So if you put it in a bunch of little places, then you're more likely to at least have a little bit of food.
Right.
If someone did happen to come along.
Exactly. Yeah. And then when would it be, let's say, appropriate where you don't have to do that? Obviously, there's no one around that you're going to come along. Or you can actually guard your hoard. A lot of animals, like chipmunks, they go down during the wintertime, they become dormant. Their burrows are usually full of seeds. So initially what they do is they scatter hoard. And then after they've collected all these different seeds, they actually go down, take them all into the burrow, and wake up once in a while, eat some, and then go back to sleep. And of course, obviously, if something comes along, they might wake up in time to defend it. So, you know, with my wood thing, it's kind of an obsessive-compulsive behavior, I was able to defend my wood. That was very important to me. If someone came along, I'd get really upset. Even wood that was lying around that I hadn't cut up, but that I was going to, that's my wood, right? So that's crazy. Anyway, so in terms of proximate mechanisms, we do, how do food caching birds find their caches? What are the neural mechanisms that support the memory? These are all proximate mechanisms. How changes in concentration of corticosterone, it's a stress hormone, affect memory. How changes in testosterone affect aggressive behavior. All those things are actually proximate mechanisms. Okay, let's see here. Start that again. It turns out scrub jays are not really good. I had a friend who was looking at a bunch of different jays. We had this outdoor aviary, and we'd have the animals actually cache. We used these radioactive seeds that we had made. They're not biologically active, so we could trace them. And scrub jays just don't do well in any sort of captivity. They just don't work. But we used Clark's nutcrackers, and they worked fine. We used, let's see, I think Mexican jays, and they did pretty good too. So it depends on the species. So we can either do it inside a lab, a real controlled setting, or we did kind of a half and half where it was out in the field, but in an aviary where it was controlled.
But did they have an ample supply of food? I'm just
Well, we
wondering.
would give them, exactly.
So they would, even though they didn't have an issue with food,
They would still do it.
they would still do it?
Yeah.
And these were born in captivity, or they were caught?
No, they were caught. They were caught.
I guess I'm wondering what would happen if they were born in captivity. Would they still have this?
That's a good question. I don't remember the literature on it. I think it's one of those things probably where they probably watched their parents initially, and that, but it's also an innate response. I mean, it's such a there's so much strong selection favoring that that depending on the species that really rely on caching, there's all that, neural mechanisms and all that allow that to actually happen.
Do you know if parrots cache in the wild?
Yeah, they do.
They do.
Yeah, they do too. Now, it turns out that these guys, they, what was I gonna say? They're seed dispersers. You would think, well, no, they're actually seed predators, right? They're eating the seeds, they're recovering all the seeds. But it turns out they're actually seed dispersers. So plants, a lot of times, they make a lot of seeds, and these animals are compulsive obsessive about caching. Obviously, it's important that they cache and they have enough food to survive the winter. If there's a poor crop, let's say, and there's not other food, you'll have tremendous losses in terms of the population. So they're going to cache and cache and cache until they can't cache anymore. They're just completely focused on that. So what happens is those animals don't necessarily recover all the caches that they made. In fact, in years of, let's say, a big pinyon pine crop, they'll make far more caches than they will ever recover all the way through the spring and when there's more food available. In other years, everything they cache, they recover because there's not a big crop, and so they're not seed dispersers. So in terms of the plant's perspective, in some years they're seed dispersers, in other years they're not. So this is, I did a lot of caching stuff, and let's see, where's that? Where is it? Okay, doesn't matter. Anyway, sour shrub, let's see, right? This is a sour shrub, and it's for desert peach. It's a plant that I was working on that relies on, it's actually related to almonds and peaches and prunus, all those stone fruits. A lot of those plants rely on, let's say, birds to eat the fruit. They don't know, it's a reward. They fly away, they poop out the stones, and they germinate. But this species is found in the desert where having a fleshy fruit is kind of expensive. And they rely on caching behavior. In this case, not birds, all rodents. And so what I did was we put out these nuts that were, I think I put out 200 of them. They were numbered and labeled with a radioisotope. They were cached, and then we went out and with a Geiger counter and tracked the seeds. So we want to know whether all the seeds were recovered or not, and if this kind of behavior actually enhanced the fitness of plants. So these rodents, of course, they don't recover everything. They might get eaten in the meantime, but they're also, a lot of them have pretty good olfactory senses, and so they're stealing from each other as well. So a lot of these animals recache seeds. So this is kind of what it looked like over a period of time. So here we go. Okay, so these are the first caches that I found. Was right around this time of year. Okay, I hope that's working. Okay. Come on. Okay, so these are times when I went back out. This is later in the whole thing. So as you can see, over time, initially there's a lot of caches. A lot of those recovered. Initially, I'd get 75% back, and then over time I'd start losing them. I'd find shells, so I know some were eaten and recovered. Some were recovered and I could never find them after that. And then at the very end, I was able to actually find out, well, seedlings. So in this case, these guys right here, empty caches, all these, right? Caches that are still occupied, those sorts of things. So you can actually track what the animals are doing. You can't exactly know who's doing what, which is the problem. But there are some people that have been doing stuff in the tropics where they have this huge camera system, and they can actually show, they can identify individual animals coming back and seeing whether the animals are going back to their own caches, perhaps to remind themselves where they are, or going back and then moving them, or some other animal coming along and taking them and moving them so they know where they are. So there's this kind of shell game going on. Okay. 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 So these are all, well, this is a little chickadee. These are fairy wrens. These are bee eaters. And this is an agouti in South America. It's a rodent. We don't have those kinds of rodents around here. But they're huge cachers. This guy is actually caching Brazil nuts. And of course, why do animals cache food? Well, we already have a pretty good idea of why they're caching food. But there's other things that are going on here. So these are actually cooperative breeders. These fairy wrens. In other words, what happens is the previous year's brood, sometimes instead of going off on their own and breeding, they actually stick around and help. Now, why do they do that? I mean, if they went out and bred themselves, they would have their own offspring, right? Instead, they're actually helping basically their sisters and brothers and helping their parents, so they get it's a matter of inclusive fitness, right? They get the fitness of helping because they're related to their sisters and brothers either by half, 0.5 or 0.4, 0.25 if they're half sibs. Okay, so depending on the environment, in some years there might be so much food it's better just to go off and breed by yourself. In other words, also, new birds probably don't breed as well as their adults because they don't know enough. They're still kind of teenagers, and you know how teenagers are. They're running around, they're having lots of sex, but they're not really paying attention very much. And teenagers usually don't really make great parents. Some do, but in general, they don't. So, now, same thing with bee eaters. First of all, they have to remember which nests are theirs, and then there's the same sort of kind of behavior going on in terms of remembering or helping parents, and when it's probably helpful to help your parents and when it's not. So these are kind of ultimate. Now, of course, the actual helping part, there's a lot of different things involved, and those are all proximate mechanisms.
So they only help relatives? They don't-
Generally, yeah. So this is kin selection.
So do they grow up and they stay in the same group together? Or
Well,
do they-
okay, so these guys, it's relatives,
Right.
okay, for the most part. The fairy wrens in Australia, there is some dispersal, and so new animals coming in, but it is kind of a family group.
But do they grow up together or do they go?
No,
back?
eventually they go off and
They go
now,
back.
actually, in some fairy wrens, they actually stay together a very long time. So it's an ongoing sort of process. There's a kind of let's see, the acorn woodpeckers around here. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're actually gregarious they have family groups. In that case, there's some individuals, of course, who are related, but also there are unrelated individuals, and they're kind of all helping each other because they really, they store acorns in granaries. So you come to a tree that's an old dead tree, and they'll have holes in them, and there'll be little acorns, thousands of them. And so it's easier to protect their caching. In that case, it's a hoard, if there's a bunch of them. But there's also, at the same time with those birds, they're not all exactly in it together. There's usually a female who's kind of an alpha female. And so when other females lay eggs, she's oftentimes trying, when they're not around, she's trying to push out the other eggs and, off out of the nest. So there's this kind of helping increases the success for everybody. And there's a certain amount of inclusive fitness, but at the same time, there's a fair bit of competition going on as well. Okay, so this is just a kind of scientific method. You see something, you want to know what the hell's going on. You come up with a whole bunch of potential explanations. The animals that are caching, well, they're doing it to help the plant, right? That's one explanation. Why would an animal actually want to help the plant? Well, they need the plant because for their food. But if you actually were to test that, you'd find out that no, the animal is doing it for itself. It just so happens that the plant is getting a dispersal advantage by providing a reward. So you come up with, let's say, two different hypotheses. One of them is helping the plant. The other one is it's basically a personal thing. It's a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In this case, it's different sorts of scratching. The animal that gets a reward, the plant gets dispersal and gets some benefit from that. And then, of course, you find out each one makes different predictions about what's going on. And you find out which test actually supports the hypothesis. If you think the animals would ever actually purposely, let's say, plant seeds or eat fruit just to help the plant get dispersed?
Maybe.
I mean, they would, let's say they'd be, would it be better for them just to, no, I'm doing it for my own. I don't need any behavior that, there might be, but it's always invadable by a cheater. If then in that case, let's say you have one of those scrub jays, and all he does is actually pilfer other caches. He doesn't make any of his own. He's a free rider, right? So there has to be some sort of a mechanism to stop that from happening. What time is it?
2:11.
We still have a little time. So, guys, with this, and this is what we're going to be doing if you read the book, and what we're going to be doing in class. We're really going to be concentrating on asking questions, seeing something, asking questions, why it happens, coming up with hypotheses. Hypotheses make predictions. Hopefully they're divergent, so you can actually test them. And then finding out where most of the evidence supports one hypothesis or another. A lot of times you might produce a whole bunch of alternate hypotheses, not just one hypothesis and, let's say, a null hypothesis. So, of course, the hypothesis has to address whether it's an ultimate mechanism or approximate mechanism, either one. The pattern may simply show that there's a relationship between certain variables, but it can explain kind of like, let's say you really don't know what's going on, and you collect a bunch of data and you see what is correlated with with each other, and then you can maybe start to think about how that system might work and what are the actual mechanisms behind it. So these are little chickadees. They also cache. They usually cache in bark. They also fly in mixed flocks, right? So there's seasonal variation in the hippocampal volume. In other words, their hippocampus changes depending on whether they're caching or not. So during the winter, they have to come back and remember where those seeds were. So their hippocampal volume definitely changes in terms of spatial memory and where things are. And then, of course, one hypothesis is that hippocampal volume with more neurons results in better spatial memory. So I guess we could just, let's see. You can kind of read this yourself. Obviously, prediction 1 is spatial memory performance, and chickadees vary seasonally. There should be a seasonal variation. Any changes in spatial memory performance should be accompanied by changes in hippocampal volume. Those are both predictions for that hypothesis. So there also might be, when do they cache? Perhaps they cache, especially in temperate climates when winter's coming along. There's a much greater need for that so that they have food for the winter. So you see this pattern, you want to know whether that's true or not. And in this case, you'd probably, let's see, you'd probably have, it'd be hard to run actual experiments on that, but I guess you could. Oh, okay, and also another prediction is that you can make the food limited or unpredictable, and so that might initiate caching behavior as well, and that coincides with temperature. Okay, I think we'll call it quits there.